There is a silent contract between the citizen and the state. It is not written in any specific law, but it is present in every faucet you turn on, in every traffic light that works, in every time an emergency number is dialed and someone answers. That contract says essentially this: when something goes very wrong, someone will show up to fix it. Most people have never had to question that premise, and that is precisely why it is so dangerous. This documentary was not made to generate distrust in institutions. Competent governments exist. Trained civil defense agents exist. Emergency response plans exist. The problem is not the existence of these systems. The problem is what happens when the scale of a crisis surpasses, simultaneously and rapidly, the response capacity of any institutional structure, no matter how efficient it may be. Severe infrastructure crises, prolonged blackouts, distribution network collapses, cascading failures caused by natural or technological events do not follow the script that contingency plans imagine. They arrive on multiple fronts at the same time. They overload precisely the most critical nodes in the response chain, and they reveal, with surgical precision, the difference between what a system promises to do and what it can actually do when normalcy disappears. What you are about to see over the next 40-some minutes are 10 categories of failure, 10 areas where, based on documented historical patterns and the structural logic of systems under pressure, any government, regardless of country, competence, or budget, would encounter real, not theoretical barriers to providing adequate response to the majority of the population. The goal is not to paralyze you with fear. It is to calibrate your perception of reality so that you know exactly where the system stops and where your responsibility begins. The food distribution system that supplies a modern city is one of the most sophisticated logistical structures ever built by humanity, and also one of the most fragile when subjected to simultaneous pressure at multiple points. Most supermarket chains operate on a model called just-in-time: minimal inventory at points of sale, constant replenishment, frequent delivery cycles. This model is extremely efficient under normal conditions. Under crisis conditions, it becomes a vulnerability. When a prolonged blackout or severe logistical disruption occurs, the collapse of food supply does not begin with supermarket shelves going empty. It begins much earlier, in the cold storage rooms that stop working, in the distribution centers that lose communication with suppliers, in the truck drivers who cannot refuel their vehicles because gas stations also depend on electricity to operate their pumps. In a large-scale blackout, this chain begins to fragment in less than 24 hours, not because people panic and buy everything at once, although that does happen and accelerates the process, but because the logistical infrastructure that sustains the continuous flow of food depends on energy, communication, and transportation in an interdependent way. In response to food crises, governments typically mobilize strategic stockpiles, coordinate emergency distribution, and deploy armed forces for logistics. These mechanisms exist and work. The issue is that they were scaled to cover regional and temporary situations, not simultaneous collapses across multiple cities with indefinite duration. National strategic stockpiles, even in the most organized countries, cover only a few days of total urban population consumption. The emergency distribution infrastructure depends on the same roads, the same fuel, and the same logistics affected by the crisis. And the human capital needed to coordinate all of this, drivers, civil defense agents, distribution center operators, are also people who, in a serious crisis, have their own families to protect. The difference between those who navigate this type of failure with relative stability and those who do not is not determined by access to unlimited supplies. It is determined by a margin of time. Having 2 to 4 weeks of high-calorie, long-shelf-life food does not turn a person into a survivalist. It turns them into someone who will not need to compete for the last products on the shelves in the first 48 hours of a crisis, which historically is the period of greatest logistical risk and most irrational collective behavior. The question worth asking is not, will my government feed me in a crisis? The right question is, for how long can I operate independently while the response system organizes itself? That shift in framing completely changes the type of preparation that makes sense. Drinking water is the most underestimated resource in any domestic crisis planning. People think about food, lighting, heating. They rarely think about water with the seriousness the topic demands, partly because it has always been available, always. Turning a faucet and finding clean water is one of the most repeated experiences of modern life. This creates an illusion of robustness that water distribution systems simply do not possess. A modern city's drinking water supply system depends on electricity for almost all of its critical functions: pumping, filtration, chlorination, quality monitoring, network pressurization. Some facilities have emergency generators. Most of those generators were sized for short-term operations, hours, not days. In a prolonged blackout lasting more than 48 hours, treatment plants without adequate backup systems begin to lose pressurization capacity. Networks that lose pressure become vulnerable to contamination through infiltration, a problem that is not immediately visible, but that can compromise water quality even after supply is restored. Governments with good contingency plans maintain fuel reserves for generators at critical stations and have water tanker trucks for emergency distribution. These resources exist. The problem is mathematical. The number of tanker trucks available to any city or state government is a tiny fraction of what is needed to supply an urban population of average density for more than a few days. To put it in perspective, a family of 4 needs approximately 15 liters per day for hydration and minimum basic hygiene. A city of 1 million inhabitants would need 15 million liters per day just for that minimum level. A standard tanker truck carries between 10,000 and 20,000 liters. The math reveals the scale of the problem with devastating precision. Properly stored water is not a resource for paranoid people. It is the only buffer between you and a vulnerability that can materialize in less than 72 hours. Adequate containers, regular rotation, emergency purification methods. These are not complex technical details. They are simple procedures that most people have never thought about because they never needed to. The fundamental difference is this: in a water supply crisis, those without their own reserves are entirely dependent on an emergency distribution infrastructure that, at urban scale, simply does not exist in sufficient volume. This is not a criticism of government planning. It is the mathematical reality of distributing an essential resource to millions of people simultaneously, without the normal infrastructure functioning. Hospitals are often presented as bastions of resilience in crises. And in many respects, they are. They have generators, emergency protocols, teams trained for high-pressure situations. But there is a critical difference between a hospital operating under its own emergency protocols and a hospital operating amid simultaneous infrastructure collapse with a massive surge in demand. In a large-scale crisis, the healthcare system is pressured simultaneously by 2 opposing forces. Demand increases dramatically, while operational capacity decreases. It increases because crises generate accidents, illnesses, and worsening of chronic conditions in people who have lost access to refrigerated medications or energy-dependent equipment. It decreases because the same problems affecting the population affect healthcare workers, who are also people, with families, with cars without fuel, with children at home without school. There is an aspect of healthcare collapse in crises that rarely receives adequate attention: the rupture of the medication and medical supply chain. Hospitals operate with inventories calculated for normal demand with limited safety margins. Chronic patients, diabetics, hypertensives, people with cardiovascular diseases, depend on medications with absolute regularity. When the distribution chain fails, this specific group faces risks that materialize not in hours, but in days. And those risks do not appear in immediate emergency numbers. They appear in the complications that emerge a week later. Governments can mobilize strategic reserves of essential medications, but the logistical response time to reach distribution points, the absence of functional communication to guide the population on where to seek these resources, and the simultaneous overload of healthcare personnel create gaps that no national plan can cover quickly enough. The most neglected variable in crisis health preparedness is simple: knowing the chronic medical conditions present in your family and ensuring a supply margin for essential medications. It is not survivalist hype. It is the same logic that makes an airline pilot check the fuel before takeoff, even if they have never run out of fuel in their life. The real possibility of supply disruption exists. The margin to protect against it is accessible. Most people have simply never thought of this as a preparedness variable. The modern economy is, in essence, a system of digital trust. Most financial transactions do not involve physical money. They involve electronic records transferred between systems that depend on energy, communication, and network connectivity to function. When any of those three dependencies fails at scale, the financial system does not stop immediately. It begins to reveal its fragility in layers. The first visible sign is the ATM that does not work, not necessarily because the bank ran out of money, but because the machine depends on energy and connectivity to authorize transactions. Next, payment terminals at establishments stop processing cards. Then the establishments themselves begin to close, because without the ability to process payments and without certainty about when the situation will normalize, operating represents risk without revenue. Central banks have business continuity plans for financial crises. They can inject liquidity, suspend operations, activate contingency systems. These plans are sophisticated and have been tested. The problem is that they were designed for financial crises: market crashes, bank panics, systemic failures. Not for physical infrastructure crises that physically prevent transaction terminals from functioning. When the problem is not a lack of money, but a lack of energy and communication to access the money that exists, monetary policy tools become irrelevant. The government can guarantee that your bank account is intact. It cannot guarantee that you will be able to access it when the infrastructure that supports that access is offline. Cash at home is not a sign of distrust in the banking system. It is recognition that access to the banking system depends on infrastructure that can fail. The right amount, the right denominations to facilitate everyday transactions, and the logic of using physical cash as a quick access reserve, not as a wealth reserve, are the principles that determine whether this preparation will work when needed. In historically documented crises, from severe snowstorms to prolonged blackouts, the establishments that kept functioning and the individuals who managed to access essential goods were, consistently, those who had immediate physical liquidity. It was not a matter of wealth, it was a matter of access format. Communication is the variable that transforms a manageable crisis into chaos, not because people need entertainment or social media, but because communication is the mechanism by which decisions are coordinated, resources are located, and critical information flows between those who have it and those who need it. Modern mobile networks have backup energy systems, batteries and generators that keep towers running for hours after a blackout. The problem is that in a large-scale crisis, when the entire population tries to make calls at the same time, networks become overloaded quickly. It is not a lack of energy. It is traffic congestion. Networks were sized for simultaneous use by a fraction of users, not all of them at once. Governments maintain emergency alert systems that operate on channels separate from commercial infrastructure: AM/FM radio on reserved frequencies, cell phone alert systems using specific protocols, satellite communication for response teams. These systems exist and work. The limitation is that they operate in one-way flow. The government speaks, the population listens. The capacity for two-way communication, which is what allows coordination, specific help requests, exchange of information about available resources, collapses along with the commercial infrastructure. Radios that do not depend on network infrastructure, AM/FM radio receivers powered by batteries or hand cranks, and prior knowledge of local emergency frequencies are resources whose value only becomes evident when everything else has failed. The difference between having and not having is not dramatic while everything works. In a prolonged crisis, it can be the difference between knowing where clean water is available and not knowing. Informational isolation is one of the most underestimated forms of vulnerability in crises. People who cannot access reliable information make decisions based on rumors, and decisions based on rumors in situations of scarcity have concrete consequences, frequently worse than the actual conditions of the crisis itself. Sanitation is the most neglected topic in any discussion about crisis preparedness, probably because it is uncomfortable to think about. And it is precisely that discomfort that makes it one of the most underestimated risks. Urban sewage systems depend on pumping stations to move waste through the network. Those stations depend on electricity. In a prolonged blackout, stations without adequate backup stop functioning, causing buildup and eventually backflow. Waste returning through the pipes. This phenomenon is not merely unpleasant. It is a disease vector with the potential for rapid spread in dense urban environments. Waste collection depends on vehicles, fuel, and a workforce that, in serious crises, faces the same problems as everyone else. When collection stops, accumulation begins immediately. Within days, in hot urban environments, the buildup of organic waste becomes a public health problem with surprising speed, attracting vectors, contaminating surfaces, compromising air quality in densely populated areas. Public health agencies have plans for sanitation management in crises. The problem is that these solutions depend on the same affected infrastructure: vehicles, fuel, available personnel, and priorities in a large-scale crisis force difficult choices. The same resources that could be used for sanitation management are needed for food distribution, medical transport, and dozens of other critical functions simultaneously. Managing waste at the household level during a crisis does not require sophisticated technology. It requires prior knowledge of basic procedures: separation of organic waste, safe disposal, hand sanitation with limited resources. The difference between a family that knows how to handle this and one that does not manifests not in days, but in weeks, when the health consequences of inadequate procedures begin to appear. There is a fundamental difference between what actually happens to public order in crises and what cultural representations, films, series, science fiction, suggest happens. The historical reality is more nuanced, more varied, and in many respects both more reassuring and more concerning than popular imagination suggests. In short-term crises, earthquakes, hurricanes, blackouts lasting hours or a few days, the predominant social response is cooperative, not chaotic. Communities organize, neighbors help each other, improvised support structures emerge naturally. This pattern has been documented in events such as the 2003 blackout in the northeastern United States, various European crisis experiences, and multiple natural disasters around the world. The pattern changes when duration extends. Crises that exceed 1 to 2 weeks, especially when combined with perceived scarcity of essential resources, not just real scarcity, but perceived scarcity, produce different behaviors. The transition is not abrupt. It happens gradually, driven by the erosion of trust in institutions and the perception that available resources are insufficient for everyone. Police forces were sized to operate under normal conditions, covering incidents distributed across time and space. In a large-scale crisis, the demand for intervention multiplies simultaneously while operational capacity drops, for the same reasons that affect any workforce in a crisis: fuel, communication, personnel who need to protect their own families. This does not mean abandonment of law. It means inevitable prioritization. And prioritization means that areas with lower institutional density, peripheral neighborhoods, regions with historically lower public security coverage, tend to receive slower response. This is not a pessimistic prediction. It is the consistent pattern documented in historical crises across multiple geographies. The variable that most consistently correlates with lower incidence of public order problems in prolonged crises is prior social cohesion. Communities that already have relationship networks, established mutual trust, and some form of informal organization respond in a fundamentally different way from fragmented communities. This resource cannot be created during a crisis. It needs to exist before it. Fuel is the circulatory blood of any crisis response. It is needed for the generators that keep hospitals running, for the trucks that distribute food, for ambulances, for police vehicles, for civil defense teams. It is, at the same time, one of the resources that most quickly enters distribution collapse when a crisis begins. Gas stations depend on electricity to operate their pumps. In a blackout, stations without their own generators stop functioning immediately. Those that have generators face demand multiplied by everyone who realizes what is happening and tries to refuel at the same time. The result is lines that consume available inventory in hours, leaving most of those who arrive later without access. There is an interesting structural contradiction at the core of fuel management in crises. The entities that most need fuel to respond to the crisis, medical emergencies, security forces, civil defense, compete for the same resource that the general population is trying to access. Governments can and should prioritize reserves for emergency use. But implementing that prioritization, physically ensuring fuel reaches response fleets before it is consumed by civilian demand, is operationally complex under crisis conditions. It is not about accumulating fuel in dangerous quantities. It is about understanding that the ability to operate for a few days without depending on external resupply has concrete value in the first 48 to 72 hours of a crisis, which is precisely the period when the distribution system is most disorganized. A vehicle with the tank always above half, a small reserve for use in a portable generator, and the elimination of critical dependencies on continuous energy are low-cost behavioral adjustments with disproportionately high impact when needed. In any crisis response analysis, mental health is the last item on the list, when it appears at all. It is treated as a secondary resource, something that can wait until immediate physical needs are resolved. This hierarchy has a superficial logic that hides a fundamental flaw. Mental health is not separable from physical needs in crisis situations. It directly affects the ability to make decisions, to collaborate with others, to resist paralyzing anxiety, and to maintain the basic functionality that allows one to get through the crisis. Human beings are creatures of habit and structure. Routine is not merely comfort. It is the cognitive framework within which decisions are made at low mental cost. When that framework collapses abruptly, the cognitive system faces overload. Uncertainty about duration, concern for the safety of family members, sleep deprivation caused by physical discomfort, and the absence of the small anchors that structure daily life produce states of anxiety that compromise judgment in ways the affected person frequently does not perceive in themselves. Mental health services are consistently the most vulnerable to budget cuts in normal times and the most difficult to mobilize in crises. The professionals needed, psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, cannot be easily redeployed to emergency response functions the way emergency physicians can. And the demand that arises is diffuse, distributed, and does not present itself with the visibly urgent form that a classic medical emergency does. The result is that psychological support in large-scale crises, at best, arrives weeks after the event begins. For most of the population, it simply does not arrive in an organized form. The variable most consistently associated with psychological resilience in crises, documented in research on populations affected by disasters in multiple countries, is not the absence of fear or sophisticated technical preparedness. It is the perception of having some degree of control over the immediate situation. People who have plans, even simple ones, even imperfect ones, and who have clarity about what they can do within their real limits of action, consistently demonstrate better cognitive and emotional functioning than those in a state of passive waiting. This has a direct implication for preparedness. Preparing for crises is not only logistical. It is, in significant part, preventive psychological training. Knowing that you have 2 weeks of water, that you have an alternative means of communication, that you have already thought about what to do in the first 48 hours. These elements build a foundation of perceived control that has value independent of the probability of use. The 10th problem is not operational like the previous ones. It is systemic. It is the problem that arises when all the other problems appear at the same time, and the agencies responsible for each of them must coordinate actions that depend on the same scarce resources, the same compromised communication chains, and the same political decisions that need to be made quickly under conditions of extreme uncertainty. Government contingency plans are for the most part vertical. Each agency has its protocol for its domain. Civil defense has protocols. Health has protocols. Public security has protocols. The problem is that a severe infrastructure crisis does not respect those compartments. It affects all agencies simultaneously, at different intensities, creating demands for horizontal coordination that these systems were built to minimize, not maximize. In a real large-scale crisis, no agency has a complete picture of the situation. Each has partial information about its specific domain. Synthesizing that information into a unified view that allows rational prioritization of resources is an extraordinarily difficult problem to solve in real time, especially when the communication channels between agencies are themselves compromised. Post-crisis studies of events such as Hurricane Katrina, the 2003 blackout in North America, and various European infrastructure crises consistently show the same pattern. The greatest response failures were not caused by lack of resources, but by coordination and communication failures between the entities that possessed those resources. The practical implication of this systemic problem for the individual is this. In a large-scale crisis, the coordinated response time of any institutional system will be significantly longer than official plans suggest. Not due to incompetence, but due to the mathematical complexity of coordinating multiple agencies, multiple supply chains, and multiple competing priorities in real time under degraded conditions. The buffer of individual autonomy, the ability to operate relatively independently for days or weeks while that coordination system organizes itself, is not a political statement about the role of the state. It is simply recognition that there is a gap between the start of the crisis and effective coordinated response, and that this gap has a real duration that needs to be covered by something. Shan Sham Atati. This documentary did not say that governments are inefficient. It did not say that emergency response systems are useless. It did not say that crises are inevitable, or that civilization is inherently fragile. What was said is more precise and therefore more useful. Institutional crisis response systems were built for a specific range of event size and duration. Within that range, they function reasonably well. Outside that range, in crises that exceed the scale for which they were designed, they encounter real structural limitations that no good intention or careful planning can completely eliminate. The question this documentary wants to leave is not, "Will my government protect me?" That question has an answer that depends on too many variables to be answered honestly. The more useful question is, for how long and in which dimensions can I operate autonomously while the response system organizes itself? That question has a practical answer, and the answer does not require radical lifestyle transformation, significant investment, or the adoption of a survivalist identity. Each of the 10 problems analyzed in this documentary has an accessible practical counterpart: a stockpile of high-durability food, adequate water storage, a supply margin for essential medications, liquidity in physical cash, alternative means of communication, basic knowledge of emergency sanitation, cohesion with the immediate community, a fuel margin, psychological preparedness through clarity of plans, temporary energy autonomy. None of these items is sophisticated. None is expensive. None turns a person into a survival expert. Collectively, they represent the difference between being completely dependent on an overloaded response infrastructure and having the time buffer needed for that infrastructure to organize itself and reach you. Crises are not the end of the world. They are temporary ruptures of systems that have existed for decades and that have ultimately great capacity for recovery. The problem is not the crisis itself. It is the gap between the start and the recovery. And what happens to the people who were not prepared to cross it? Understanding where the system stops is the first step to knowing where you begin. That is what this documentary was about.